No one wanted the old draft horse, until the day he stepped into the fire and revealed a truth that shook our entire town. People in Timberfall used to say the old draft horse was useless, a quiet, broken shadow left behind by time. But on the night the wildfire came roaring over the ridge, he did something no one expected. And when the smoke cleared, a truth long buried finally stepped back into the light. By late afternoon, the sky over Wyoming had turned the color of old pewter, a dull metallic gray that swallowed the sun without ceremony. Snow came down in dry, whispering flakes, floating across the two-lane highway and piling up in the ruts ahead of the old pickup. Claire Dawson's hands were tight on the steering wheel, the skin across her knuckles, pale. She'd driven this road as a teenager in a cheaper truck with a louder radio, but back then she hadn't noticed how the mountains closed in around Timberfall, how the pines leaned over the road like they were listening. Now she noticed everything. Her phone lay dark and face down on the passenger seat next to a folded envelope from the attorney who'd handled her mother's will. Under it was a thin folder of bills she hadn't opened yet, student loans, lingering medical expenses, a credit card that had quietly grown teeth over the past year. She caught herself wondering, absurdly, if she should finally sit down with someone about retirement planning, about life insurance, about any kind of future at all. Then she remembered the last time she'd tried to plan anything, and her chest tightened. The sound of a heart monitor, fast at first, then slowing. A pair of eyes, wide with fear, watching her while she pressed her palms into a stranger's chest in the back of an ambulance. The smell of antiseptic and diesel, her partner's voice, too calm, telling the ER nurse the time of death while she stood there with her hands still hovering in the air, trying to remember how to breathe. Claire blinked, and the image broke apart like ice underfoot. Eyes on the road, she muttered to herself, as if she were still in training, still the eager paramedic who believed that doing everything right meant everything would turn out okay. The snow thickened, blurring the trees into smudges. Up ahead, the old wooden sign appeared out of the whiteness. Timberfall, Pop, 1972. Someone had nailed a rusted horseshoe to the post, probably for luck. It hadn't helped her mother much. She downshifted as the road sloped gently into the valley. Lights from town began to flicker through the snow. Neon from the diner, a hardware store still open, the steady glow from the gas station where loggers and ranch hands talked weather and beef prices. Claire didn't stop. She followed the road as it curved past town, past the tiny clinic where she'd gotten her first physical, past the church whose bell she'd listened to from her childhood bedroom on Sundays. Another mile, and she turned onto a narrower road, fresh snow squeaking under the tires. The landscape opened into patchwork fields, edged with barbed wire and sagging wooden posts. At the end of the lane, just where the land rose toward the first line of pines, a fence she knew by heart came into view. The Dawson place. The gate leaned slightly to one side, as if the years had become too heavy. The paint had long since peeled, leaving gray, weathered boards scarred by wind and winter. Her mother had always talked about fixing it, repainting it a bright color someday, the way she'd talked about going to the coast or finally replacing the old wood stove. Someday had not arrived before the cancer did. Claire braked to a stop in front of the gate and let the engine idle, its low rumble the only sound in the stillness. Snowflakes landed on the windshield and melted slowly, leaving trails of water like tired tears. She could turn around, go back to the city, find another job in another county, maybe not on an ambulance this time. Urgent care, maybe, or a quiet clinic that specialized in wellness checkups and blood pressure medication. Something stable, with decent health insurance and a schedule that didn't wake her at 3 in the morning with phantom sirens in her ears. But the thought of fluorescent lights and white walls made her stomach twist. Claire shut off the engine. The sudden silence was so complete she could hear the soft tick of cooling metal under the hood. For a long moment she sat there, fingers still wrapped around the steering wheel, watching her breath fog the glass. "Okay," she said aloud, her voice small in the cab. "Okay." She opened the door. The cold hit her in the face, clean and sharp, smelling of snow and pine and something older, something like memory. Her boots sank into the fresh layer, snow creaking softly beneath her weight as she walked to the gate. The chain was the same one her father had used, thick and stubborn. He'd been the one to string the first line of fence along this field, his hands rough and sunburned, his temper short on drought years. He'd left before the fence was finished, before Claire learned that some people could disappear without offering an explanation. She shook off the thought and worked the chain loose. Metal bit at her bare fingers. She hissed and tucked her hands back into her gloves, breathing on them. The gate swung open with a protesting groan. For a heartbeat, she saw herself at 17, leaning on this very post, talking about online college degrees and big city futures, while her mother stood in the doorway, smiling like she already knew how the story would go. Claire drove the truck up the rutted driveway, past the old cottonwood tree where she used to hang a tire swing. The tree's branches were bare now, black fingers against the gray sky. The house emerged from the snow like a tired animal. Low, wide, and the same dull, weather-beaten color as the barn behind it. She parked in front of the porch and killed the engine. The quiet was deeper here, the sort of quiet that had its own texture. Wind threaded through the dry grass, a soft, sibilant sound. A crow called once from somewhere in the trees, and then fell silent again. The porch steps sagged a little under her weight, wood creaking in protest. Claire paused with her hand on the front door handle. Every muscle in her body suddenly braced for something she couldn't name. Grief, maybe. Regret. The ghost of her own teenage voice. She turned the knob. It stuck for a second, then gave way with a reluctant click. The smell hit her first. Dust and old wood, faint traces of coffee and wood smoke, the lingering shadow of her mother's lavender soap. It was like walking into a paused moment. The table stood where it always had, a ring from a coffee mug on the worn surface. The couch sagged under the weight of faded cushions. A crocheted blanket her mother had worked on for years lay folded on the back, one corner unfinished. Claire stepped inside and shut the door behind her. The sound echoed in the small house. She could see where the hospice bed had been, near the window where the light was kindest. The bed was gone now, but the indent in the rug remained, a pale rectangle in the pattern. She remembered sitting on the floor there, her back against the wall, listening to the oxygen concentrator buzz and wheeze, pretending she didn't understand what the doctor's words meant. Her chest tightened, but the tears didn't come. They rarely did anymore. Whatever place in her that had once known how to cry had worn itself out somewhere between night shifts and funeral arrangements. She set her bag down by the door and walked through the small house slowly, touching things without really seeing them. Her mother's chipped mug in the sink, a stack of old seed catalogs on the counter, a calendar still pinned to the wall from the year before, frozen in a month. Her mother had never finished living. In her old bedroom, the posters were gone, but the small nail holes remained in the wall. The bed frame creaked when she sat on it, dust puffing from the mattress. Someone had laundered the sheets, or maybe the room just no longer smelled like her at all. It smelled like emptiness. She sat there for a while, elbows on her knees, listening to the wind skim across the roof. In the city, there had always been noise. Sirens, traffic, the endless hum of late-night television leaking through apartment walls. Here, the silence was almost physical, resting on her shoulders, reminding her how small she really was in the bowl of this valley. A sensible part of her brain whispered about practical things, property taxes, home insurance, whether the well still worked, what it would cost to fix the roof before spring. Another part, the exhausted, bruised part, whispered something else. You could stay. You could let the mountains hold you for a while. No shift schedules, no radios crackling with bad news. From the kitchen window she could see the barn, crouched at the edge of the field like an old dog too stubborn to lie down completely. The paint had peeled from its sides. One corner of the roof sagged under years of snow. A faint line of fence extended from it toward the trees, posts leaning at odd angles. Her mother's voice came back to her, unbidden. I always wanted to see that barn full again. Horses in the morning mist, you remember? Your dad used to talk about that. Before he'd left with a duffel bag and a stiff goodbye, promising to send money and never quite getting around to it. Claire stood and moved back to the front room. The air felt colder now, the afternoon light draining into early evening. She flipped a switch out of habit. Nothing happened. Of course. The power company didn't keep the lights on out of sentiment. She found a box of matches on the counter, one of the old oil lamps on the shelf. The first match snapped. The second flared to life, bright and hot before settling into a steady flame. The lamp filled the room with a small golden circle of light, pushing back the gray just enough. Standing there, lamp in hand, Claire realized she had no plan beyond this moment. She had driven away from the city because she couldn't stand another night in that apartment with the phantom sirens in her ears. She had come here because the envelope from the lawyer said, "You are the sole heir." And she didn't know what else to do. Outside, something cracked faintly, the pop of a branch shifting under the weight of snow. She moved to the front window and brushed aside the curtain, peering out into the dimming world. Across the yard, just beyond the truck, she saw a shape moving near the fence line. A man in a heavy coat and hat, walking with the slow, measured gait of someone who knew this land well. His boots crunched on the frozen ground as he drew closer, breath fogging in the cold. Claire watched him for a heartbeat, the lamp warm in her hand, the house behind her full of ghosts. Then she set the lamp down, squared her shoulders, and stepped back to the door as the stranger's footsteps reached the bottom of the porch steps. Snow was still falling when Claire opened the door to the stranger on her porch. The man pushed back his hood, revealing a weathered face framed by gray stubble and eyes the color of cold river water. He looked like the kind of person mountain winters couldn't intimidate. Broad-shouldered, steady, carved by wind and work rather than time. "Evening," he said, tipping his hat. "Didn't mean to startle you. I'm Eli Barrett. I live just over that ridge." He gestured toward a line of dark pines where the land sloped upward. "Saw your truck out front. Figured you might need help settling in. Folks don't come out here much unless something's happened." Claire hesitated, then stepped back enough for him to see the dim lamplight behind her. "I'm Claire Dawson. My mother passed." The words came out flat, as if spoken from a distance. Eli nodded with the solemnity of someone who had delivered condolences too many times to count. "She was a good woman. Strong. This place kept its backbone because of her." His gaze drifted briefly across the room, taking in the boxes, the half-lit corners, the bone-deep quiet that houses wear when no one has laughed inside them for too long. "I heard you might be coming back," he added. "Didn't expect it in the middle of a snow squall, though." Claire gave a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Didn't expect it either. There was another silence, comfortable for him, uneasy for her. Then Eli cleared his throat. "Look, I won't keep you long, but you should know there's still a horse on the property. Belonged to the fellow who leased your barn a couple years back. He passed on during the summer." Claire blinked. "A horse?" "A big Belgian draft. Name's Archer, or at least that's what was on the papers. Some folks around here call him useless, but that's just because they don't know what they're looking at." His tone wasn't angry, more like someone stating a fact he found disappointing. "He's been alone since August. Eats if you put feed out, drinks from the trough, but he doesn't do much else." Something in the way he said it made Claire's pulse tighten. Alone since August. She knew what that kind of silence could do to a living thing. "You should see him," Eli said gently. "He doesn't belong in a barn with nobody checking on him." He paused. "And you could use the company yourself. Nothing makes a place feel alive again like something else breathing in it." Claire swallowed. The idea of being responsible for another creature, even one that required little more than hay and patience, felt heavier than she wanted to admit. But she nodded. "All right. Show me." Eli stepped aside so she could grab her coat and gloves. Together they crossed the yard, the snow crunching beneath their boots. The cold pressed against Claire's lungs, sharp and medicinal, like something meant to wake her up from months of numbness. The barn loomed larger the closer they got, its roof sagging, and its paint long since surrendered to the Wyoming winters. When Eli slid the door open, the hinges groaned like a tired memory. The lamplight spilled a thin yellow band across the floor, illuminating floating flecks of dust. And there, at the far end of the barn, stood the horse. Archer was massive, bigger than anything Claire had ever seen outside of documentaries. Broad shoulders, a thick neck, and a powerful chest made for hauling the world behind him. His coat, a rich golden brown, had dulled into something closer to mud and frost. His bony hips hinted at months of minimal care, but his frame was unmistakably strong. What struck her most, though, were his eyes. They didn't turn toward her. He didn't flick an ear or shift his weight. He stood perfectly still, facing the back wall, as if carved from loneliness itself. "He always like this?" Claire whispered. "Pretty much," Eli replied. "Hasn't moved much since he lost his owner. Some animals grieve. Folks don't like to admit that, but it's true." He lowered his voice, softer now. "And some give up. Just stop participating in their own lives." Claire exhaled slowly. She knew something about that. She approached Archer with quiet steps, stopping a few feet behind him. His ribs expanded and contracted with a slow, heavy rhythm. She could see the frost from his breath drifting into the stale air. "Hey," she said gently, though she wasn't sure why. Maybe to test if anything inside him still reached outward. For a moment, nothing. Then, so subtly she almost missed it, one ear twitched. Not toward her, but upward, as if noticing something he wasn't ready to acknowledge. "He hears you," Eli murmured. Claire took another slow step. "He seems sad," Eli nodded once. Animals know loss, and this one's had more than his share. There was something else in the barn, unspoken, hovering between them like dust motes in the light, something Eli wasn't saying. But Claire didn't ask. Not yet. Instead, she let her gaze wander over the horse, the thick winter coat in need of brushing, the tangled mane, the faint outline of a scar running along his flank. A life written in marks she couldn't read yet. Archer shifted just enough for his hoof to scrape the packed dirt. It wasn't movement, so much as acknowledgement. A small, tired gesture that felt heavier than any roar. Claire felt it like a pull in her chest. A recognition she didn't want, but couldn't turn from. People dump animals when they're old or broken, Eli said quietly. But sometimes they just need someone to look at them and see more than what's missing. His words settled in the cold air like falling ash. Claire didn't touch Archer. She wasn't sure he would welcome it, and she wasn't sure she could bear the rejection if he stepped away. Instead, she stood there, letting her presence be the only offering she had. "I'll check on him tomorrow," she said. Her voice was low, but steady. Eli nodded. "He'll appreciate that, even if he won't show it. Not yet." As they walked back toward the house, Claire glanced over her shoulder. Through the barn door's narrow gap, she saw Archer still standing, silent and colossal against the shadows. But for the first time since she'd stepped into Timberfall, she didn't feel completely alone. It wasn't comfort, exactly. More like the faint suggestion of it, like a previously forgotten melody she almost recognized. Inside the house again, she lit the lamp and watched the flame tremble, its light warming the room by degrees. Snow tapped against the windows, soft and steady. Her gaze drifted to the barn through the frosted glass. She wondered who Archer had been before he became the horse nobody wanted. She wondered why she cared. She didn't have answers. Not yet. But tomorrow, she would go back. She owed him that much. Morning came slowly to Timberfall, slipping into the valley on a pale ribbon of light that barely touched the snow-capped fields. Claire woke to a quiet so complete it took her a moment to steady herself. No sirens, no radios, no voices calling her name from an ambulance bay, just the sound of wind brushing along the siding of the house and the soft tick of metal contracting in the cold. She dressed in layers, her breath fogging in the chilly bedroom, and stepped outside with a steaming mug of coffee warming her hands. The kind of coffee her mother used to make, strong, a little bitter, earthy enough to remind her she was alive. The air bit at her cheeks as she crossed the yard. The barn stood in its usual half-slouch, as if trying not to draw attention, but Claire felt the same pull toward it she had felt the night before. She slid the door open with both hands. The hinges complained, but the sound was softer this time, like the barn had grown used to her. Inside, Archer stood exactly where she'd last seen him, but something in the air felt different, still, but expectant. Claire approached him slowly, her boots crunching softly across the straw. "Morning," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, unsure why she felt the need to keep it gentle. Maybe out of respect. Maybe out of fear she would frighten away whatever faint connection had begun forming between them. Archer didn't turn, but he lifted his head just an inch. That tiny movement might as well have been a shout in the quiet barn. Claire's breath caught, though she didn't let herself read too much into it. Animals shifted all the time. Horses twitched. But this felt deliberate. She set her coffee down and stepped to the side to gather the tools she needed: a stiff brush, a curry comb, a small metal bucket. The tools were old, worn by hands she didn't know, but familiar in the way farm tools always felt. Simple, honest, without pretense. She approached Archer again, pausing at a respectful distance. "Let's try something," she murmured. She raised the brush slowly. Archer's ear flicked toward her, then forward again. He didn't move away. That alone felt like a victory. Claire began brushing gently, starting at his shoulder. Dirt and old dander lifted into the air in soft clouds. The barn smelled of hay, dust, and something warm she remembered from childhood mornings. Horses smelled like earth that had learned to breathe. With each long stroke, a patch of Archer's true coat emerged beneath the dullness, golden brown and glinting faintly in the early light. "Good," she said softly, though she didn't know whether she was reassuring him or herself. Her hand ached a little from the pressure, but she didn't stop. She swept the brush down, his side and across his back, working slowly, pausing often to let him get used to the sensation. Sometimes he shifted a hoof. Sometimes his skin twitched under the brush. Once, he let out a deep, heavy exhale that ghosted in the cold air, warming the space between them. Claire felt her chest loosen at the sound. Not joy. Not yet. But something like the memory of joy. "Most horses lean into the brush," she said quietly. "Some even nudge you when you miss their favorite spot." She smiled faintly. "You're not like most horses, huh?" Archer didn't respond, but his muscles relaxed under her touch. The barn, which had felt vast and hollow the night before, now felt smaller, as if the air had settled around them in a protective cocoon. She worked her way down his side, stopping when she reached the scar along his flank. It ran like a pale river through the darker fur, old, healed, but unmistakable. Claire lifted her hand, not brushing that area yet. Scars were stories, and she didn't yet know how to read his. "I won't touch that for now," she said gently. "You tell me when you're ready." For the first time, Archer turned his head slightly toward her, just enough for one dark eye to meet hers. Claire froze. His gaze wasn't curious. It wasn't hopeful. It wasn't frightened. It was tired. The kind of tired she recognized intimately. The tired that came from trying too hard, feeling too much, losing too deeply. His eye held a depth that pulled her in, an echo of something she had felt on the day she'd walked out of the ambulance bay, her hands still shaking from the failed resuscitation. She took a slow breath, then another. "It's okay," she whispered. "I get it." The words came out before she had thought them through. They felt true. Maybe more true than anything she had said in months. Archer blinked once, slowly, then turned his head back. It wasn't dismissal. It was trust, not complete, not certain, but the beginning of something fragile. Claire finished brushing him and stepped back, wiping her hands on her jeans. Her breath puffed in small clouds. She watched Archer for a moment longer, noticing how his ribs moved, steady, strong, and how the brushed areas of his coat caught light like a forgotten memory resurfacing. "Tomorrow," she said softly. "I'll bring warm water. You probably haven't had a good grooming in a long time." The horse didn't react, but the barn felt different now. Warmer, more alive. She gathered the tools, leaving the bucket where he could see it, but not close enough to startle him. When she reached the barn door, she paused. The valley stretched wide outside, brightening under the weak winter sun. The air smelled of pine and cold, and the sky, though still mostly gray, had a thin edge of blue peeking through. Claire turned once more to look at Archer. The silence between them felt fuller now, shaped by breath and presence rather than emptiness. "I'll see you later," she said. She meant it. As she crossed the yard back toward the house, Claire realized with a start that this was the first morning in months she had gotten out of bed with a purpose. A small one, yes, but a purpose nonetheless. At the door, she glanced over her shoulder again. Archer hadn't moved, but she felt, in some unexplainable way, that he was listening. Inside, she poured herself another cup of coffee and stood near the window, watching the barn through the wavering steam rising from her mug. Her mind drifted, but not toward the ambulance or the sound of a monitor going flat. For the first time, she wasn't replaying that day. She was wondering what Archer had sounded like when he was young and strong. What kind of work he'd done. What kind of man had cared for him enough to leave behind a horse shaped by loyalty? The silence in the house no longer pressed against her. It simply existed. And she existed with it. Later, when she stepped back outside to bring more hay to the barn, she thought she saw Archer shift his weight as she approached, as if acknowledging her presence. It could have been nothing, but to Claire, it felt like a beginning. The next morning rose clearer than the ones before it, a thin winter sun stretching pale fingers across the valley as if testing whether the world still remembered warmth. Claire stepped out onto the porch with a thermos tucked under her arm and a halter draped over her shoulder. The cold bit at her cheeks, but the kind of cold that woke instead of numbed. Timberfall had that effect, harsh but strangely gentle, like a mountain that expected you to respect it, but didn't mind offering you a place to rest. She made her way toward the barn, boots sinking into the snow with soft, satisfying crunches. A faint plume of breath drifted from the slightly open top window, proof Archer was awake, or at least breathing with enough presence to fog the air. Claire paused at the door, letting her hand rest on the worn wood before sliding it open. Archer stood where she'd left him, but the air inside felt subtly different, less stagnant, more attentive. Maybe it was her imagination, but she sensed a shift in him, the smallest change in how he carried his massive frame. He turned his head just a fraction when she entered. It wasn't much, barely a ripple of acknowledgement, but it was far more than she'd hoped for. "Morning," she whispered. The word floated in the cool barn air, steady and gentle. She approached slowly, offering the sound of her boots, the shape of her breath, letting Archer absorb her presence at his own pace. She'd learned in her years as a paramedic that sometimes the quietest approach was the safest. The way you entered homes where grief was heavy, where panic lived just below the surface. People in pain didn't want explanations. They wanted steadiness. Horses, she was learning, weren't so different. Eli arrived minutes later, steps firm, coat dusted, with snow. He carried a bucket of warm water that steamed in the cold air, along with a set of grooming tools that looked older than both of them combined. "You're early," he said. "Couldn't sleep." He nodded once, not pressing for details. "Let's show you how to talk to him without saying a word." Claire glanced at Archer. "I thought talking quietly helped." "It does," Eli said, "but horses talk louder with silence. It's in how you breathe, how you stand. A twitch of your shoulder tells him more than a paragraph ever will." She swallowed, suddenly aware of every muscle in her body. Eli set the bucket down. Steam curled upward, blurring Archer's outline like he was part of a dream, struggling to stay whole. Eli stepped closer, slow and steady, letting Archer watch him. His hand rested at his side, open, relaxed. "You don't want squared shoulders," he murmured. "Predators do that. You want to angle your body a bit. soft eyes. Think like you're walking into a room where someone's grieving. Claire stiffened at the words, but nodded. She moved to Archer's left side, keeping her steps measured. Her breath came out slow, even, the way they trained her to breathe during high-stress calls, to anchor herself when panic tried to tighten her chest. Archer's ear twitched. Claire angled her body as Eli had shown her. Her hands stayed low. "Good," Eli said. "Now show him the halter." She lifted it slowly. Archer didn't step back, though he shifted his weight. Claire felt the air tighten between them. "It's okay," she murmured, voice low. But Eli laid a hand on her arm. "Don't say anything unless you need to. Horses read energy. Words get in the way. Just breathe." Claire nodded and let the silence stretch. Let the barn do its work. The smell of hay, the creak of beams in the frost, the soft sound of Archer's breath. After a long moment, Archer lowered his head by the smallest degree. Not a submission, not quite trust, but a gesture that meant he was willing to try. Claire stepped closer, heart beating faster with each inch of distance closed. She slipped the halter up carefully, watching Archer's eyes the whole time. When it settled in place, her breath came out in a trembling exhale. Eli smiled gently. "Good. That's the first time he's let anyone halter him in months." Claire didn't respond. She was too busy marveling at the warmth radiating from Archer's neck, the quiet life humming beneath his skin. Touching him felt like laying a hand on the earth itself, solid, steady, ancient. Eli handed her the lead rope. "Now, a step, just one." She tugged lightly. Archer didn't move. "Don't pull," Eli said softly. "Ask." "How do I—" "Shift your weight back, not forward. Show him you're moving away, not dragging him." Claire tried again, shifting her center of gravity just as Eli had taught. Archer watched her with one dark eye, unblinking, assessing. She breathed once more. Slow, steady. And then Archer took a step. A simple, deliberate step. The barn floor groaned under his weight, but the sound was beautiful, like something waking up after a long winter. Claire felt tears prick behind her eyes, unexpected and hot. She blinked them away, embarrassed. Eli pretended not to notice. "That's it," he said. "He remembers." They spent the next hour moving in slow circles, just a few feet at a time. Sometimes Archer stopped. Sometimes he followed. Sometimes he only leaned his head slightly, as if deciding whether she was worth the effort. Claire didn't push him. She matched his pace, his breath, his stillness. At one point, when she paused to adjust the rope, Archer took a tiny step toward her, unprompted. It was nothing, a mere inch. But to Claire, it was everything. Outside, the wind picked up, tossing snow across the pasture. The mountains loomed in the distance, sharp and indifferent. But inside the barn, the world felt softer, made of warm breath and quiet rhythms, of the fragile trust forming between a woman trying to remember how to hope and a horse who had nearly forgotten why it mattered. When Archer finally lowered his head and let out a long, rumbling sigh, Eli's voice came low and reverent. "That's the mountain breath," he said. "Means he feels safe. Horses only breathe like that when they're letting go." Claire didn't answer. Her throat was too tight. She stepped closer, resting her hand just above Archer's shoulder. His coat was warm under her palm, a living heat that softened the cold of her fingers. "Thank you," she whispered. barely audible. Archer didn't move, but he didn't pull away either. And in that stillness, in the shared quiet between two wounded creatures learning how to stand without collapsing, Claire felt something shift inside her, subtle and seismic all at once. Not a healing. Not yet. But the faintest suggestion that healing was possible. The storm clouds that gathered over Timberfall that afternoon looked heavy enough to break the ridge in half, but the air held a strange softness beneath the cold. Claire stood in the doorway of the barn, watching Archer shift his weight from one broad hoof to the other, as if preparing himself for something he could not name. She had brushed him earlier, taken her time combing through tangles that had lived there for months, maybe years. Now his coat caught the faint, dim light drifting in through the high window, making him look less like a forgotten relic and more like some ancient guardian thawing from stone. Eli arrived just as Claire was fastening the feed bin. He walked slower today, his steps deliberate, the kind of gait men adopt when the weather reminds them of old injuries. Snow peppered his shoulders, melting into dark patches on his coat. He didn't speak at first. Instead, he stood beside Claire, hands deep in his pockets, staring at Archer as though seeing someone he'd once known. "You ever notice," Eli said finally, "that some animals carry their memories in their backs, the way people carry them behind their ribs?" Claire didn't answer right away. She was watching the way Archer's ears flicked, not in irritation, but in that thoughtful way horses sometimes did when they were listening closely to something inside themselves. "I've seen it in patients," she murmured. "Humans, I mean. Trauma settles in quiet places." Eli nodded once, slowly. Same for him. He stepped forward, running a hand gently along Archer's neck. The horse didn't flinch. He didn't exactly welcome the touch either, but he tolerated it. And tolerance from a creature like Archer felt like the first step across a bridge that had nearly rotted away. Claire waited for Eli to speak again. She could feel something shifting in the air, a weight settling between them that wasn't quite unpleasant, just old. "You should know something," Eli said, voice lower now, as if the barn itself needed permission to hear. "Archer wasn't always like this. He used to be the strongest horse in the canyon, steady, brave, the kind of animal you trusted when the mountain didn't give you choices." Claire frowned slightly. "You knew his previous owner?" Eli hesitated, rubbing his thumb along the edge of Archer's mane. "Knew him well enough. Good man. Quiet kind. Worked rescue. The mountain respected him." She studied Eli's profile, the deep grooves in his face carved by wind and loss. "What happened to him?" "A rock slide," Eli said simply. "Late spring, about 2 years ago. He was up on the North Ridge helping recover an injured hiker. The ground gave way. He didn't make it." Archer shifted at the words, almost imperceptibly, his massive ribs expanding in a long, unsteady breath. Claire felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "And Archer?" she asked softly. "He was there," Eli replied. "Tried to pull the man out even when the harness gave way. Tried until he couldn't move. They found him half buried, still bracing his body uphill like he thought he could hold the whole mountain together." Claire swallowed, throat tight. She could imagine it. Archer standing against the slide, muscles straining, refusing to leave the man he'd trusted. She didn't need many details. She'd seen loyalty like that, in human and animal form, in the cramped back rooms of emergency departments and the narrow hallways of fire stations. "He was injured?" she asked. Eli nodded. "Took months before he could walk right. The owner's family didn't want him. Cost too much to keep a horse that big when he couldn't work, and they didn't know what he'd been before the accident. Most people never do. They sold him cheap. He bounced around a bit, ended up here. Claire let the silence settle again. Archer's steady breath was the only sound in the barn. She looked at the horse with new eyes, the scar beneath his coat no longer just a mark of injury, but a testament to what he had survived. "He's not useless," Claire said quietly. "No," Eli murmured. "He's grieving." Claire exhaled slowly. "Like some people." He gave her a pointed look, one that saw too much but didn't press. "Thing is," Eli said, stepping back, "grief doesn't kill the good in a creature. It just buries it deep. But deep doesn't mean gone." Archer raised his head then, turning it toward Claire with slow, ponderous motion. His eye met hers, dark, gleaming, filled with a kind of tired intelligence she hadn't fully understood until now. She took a single step forward, and when she lifted her hand, Archer didn't turn away. He let her place her palm against his cheek, warm and firm and real. Something fragile passed between them in that moment, not trust exactly, but recognition, a shared understanding carved by loss. Claire felt her breath catch. She didn't move her hand. Neither did he. "You said he saved people," she whispered. "More than once?" Eli nodded. "Plenty of times. Archer knows how to listen to the mountain, how to stand where the ground shifts, how to move when storms come. Some horses pull weight. He pulled lives." Claire blinked hard, her vision blurring for a second. Her own memories surged, images of stretchers, frantic hands, heart monitors that screamed and then fell silent. The helplessness, the exhaustion, the failures she couldn't forget. "What if he never heals?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Eli's answer came without hesitation. "Then he'll still be worth standing beside. Some beings aren't measured by what they can do, but by what they've already endured." Claire looked at Archer again, at the quiet strength in him, the way he seemed carved out of earth and sorrow, the way he'd allowed her into his silence. She had come to Timberfall expecting to bury part of her life. She hadn't expected to find a creature who held pieces of it in ways she didn't yet understand. Archer lowered his head slowly, brushing his muzzle just slightly against her sleeve, the barest whisper of contact, but enough to make Claire's breath falter. "That," Eli murmured, "is him telling you he knows." Claire didn't know what to do with the sudden tightness in her chest, the heat pressing behind her eyes. Grief, she thought, wasn't always sharp. Sometimes it was soft. Sometimes it looked like a horse leaning a fraction of its weight into your presence because being alone had become too heavy. She stood there until her fingers grew numb, until Archer's breath warmed her wrist, until the barn felt less like a relic and more like a place where something could begin again. Later, when she stepped out into the open air, the clouds had thickened. A storm was coming. She could smell it, cold and metallic, like the quiet before a world tilts. But inside her, something had shifted. Not enough to name, but enough to notice. As she walked back toward the house, Claire felt Archer's gaze follow her from the barn's shadowed doorway. For the first time since she'd returned to Timberfall, she didn't feel like she was walking away from something. She felt like she was walking toward it. The wind changed at dawn. Claire felt it before she saw anything unusual. A strange metallic scent in the cold air, the kind that did not belong to snow or pine. She stepped out onto the porch and watched the tree line quiver under a stiffening breeze. The mountains themselves seemed to inhale sharply, as if bracing for something. Timberfall had its own way of warning people. Subtle at first, then undeniable. She tightened her coat around her and walked toward the barn, her boots cracking the frosted ground with each step. Archer lifted his head the moment she slid the door open. He was already alert, ears pricked toward the north ridge. The gentle heaviness he often carried was gone. Something sharper lived in his stance, a memory waking. "You smell it too," Claire whispered. A low, rolling hum reached her then. Not thunder, not wind, but something deeper. A sound that felt like the earth shuddering. She stepped outside again, scanning the horizon. A thin, dark column of smoke clawed its way upward behind the ridge, climbing fast. Too fast. Oh no! A truck barreled down the gravel road, spitting slush in all directions. Sheriff Dana Brooks climbed out before the engine stopped. Her dark coat was unbuttoned, and her breath came hard, not from the cold, but from urgency. "Claire!" she called, striding toward her. "There's a fire in the northern canyon. Fast-moving, unpredictable. We're evacuating livestock." She paused, catching Claire's expression. "This one's bad." "How bad?" Claire asked. "Worse than anything we've had in years. The wind's in the wrong direction, and the Hughes family's goats and dogs are trapped in the lower ravine. The access road washed out last spring. No vehicle can get in." Claire felt the words settle like stones in her stomach. She looked toward the barn. Archer's silhouette stood tall in the open doorway, framed by drifting dust and morning light. He didn't move, didn't fidget. He simply watched the direction of the smoke with unnerving stillness. Sheriff Brooks followed her gaze. "Don't even think about it," she said immediately. "That horse is half lame, Claire, and you barely know how to handle him." "I'm learning," Claire said quietly. "And he's stronger than you think." Dana exhaled sharply. "This isn't some scenic trail ride. The canyon's steep. One bad step and you said the animals can't be reached by truck." "Yes, but you need something that can get through rough terrain," Claire insisted. "Something that won't spook in smoke. Something that can pull weight without sinking into soft dirt." Dana stared at her, stunned. "Claire, you left emergency response work because you weren't ready. And now you're talking about dragging a traumatized draft horse into a wildfire?" Claire swallowed hard. The sheriff's words stung in places still tender, but she wouldn't let them settle. "This isn't about me," she said. "Those animals don't have time." For a long moment, only the rising wind answered. Then a shout echoed from the ridge, faint but urgent, a volunteer firefighter waving from the road above them. "The fire jumped the West Fork," he yelled. "We've got maybe an hour." Dana cursed under her breath. Claire turned to Archer again. He hadn't looked away from the smoke. Not once. "Sheriff," Claire said, softer now. "He knows." Something in Dana's face faltered. Confusion, maybe disbelief, maybe a memory of the old stories Timberfall whispered about mountain horses who saved more than they lost. Finally, Dana stepped back and rubbed a hand across her forehead. "If anyone else suggested this, I'd arrest them for reckless endangerment." "But you're not arresting me?" "Not yet," Dana muttered. She let out a frustrated breath. "Fine, but I'm sending a volunteer with you, and the minute it gets too dangerous, you turn around." Claire nodded. Her heart hammered in her chest, but it was a steady kind of fear, the kind that sharpened instead of paralyzed. She hurried back into the barn. Archer was waiting near the stall door, thick chest rising and falling with deep, focused breaths. She approached slowly, mindful of every movement. "Easy," she said softly. "We're going to help, but only if you want to." Archer lowered his head toward her, warm air drifting across her hands. It wasn't dramatic, not a heroic nod or some symbolic gesture. It was small and quiet, but unmistakably a yes. Claire slipped the halter over his head more easily than she ever had before. He didn't resist when she clipped the lead rope, or when she fastened the old leather breast collar Eli had repaired the week before. The massive horse stepped forward with purpose, not hesitation. Eli appeared at the barn entrance, breathing hard from his quick walk across the yard. His eyes widened when he saw Archer already geared up. "You sure about this?" he asked. "No," Claire answered honestly. "But I'm going." Eli nodded once, pride and worry tangled in his expression. "Then take the lower trail. It curves slow, but the footing's safer." Claire swung up onto Archer's bare back. No saddle, just the thick winter coat beneath her palms and the raw power of a creature built for mountains. He took her weight easily, almost eagerly. When they emerged from the barn, smoke smeared the sky in dark strokes. Volunteers scrambled across the ridge, shouting directions. Dana mounted her ATV, shouting, orders into her radio. Claire steered Archer toward the trail, the wind pushing smoke against her face. Halfway up the hill, the smoke thickened, burning her throat. Archer moved steadily beneath her, his massive hooves gripping the shifting earth. Claire leaned forward, trusting him, her hands buried in his mane. At one narrow bend, the trail crumbled under his front hoof. Archer paused, tested the ground, then shifted sideways with a sure-footedness that made Claire inhale sharply. "You remember this," she whispered. "Don't you?" Archer's ears flicked once, and he pressed forward. At the mouth of the ravine, the smoke thinned enough for Claire to see the shapes scattered across the narrow valley floor. A cluster of goats huddled on a ledge, a dog barking frantically beside them. The fire crackled somewhere beyond the ridge, an unseen menace drawing closer. Claire slid down from Archer's back and started uncoiling the rescue rope Dana had given her. Archer lowered his head toward the trapped animals and puffed out a deep breath, steadying the nervous goat closest to the drop. "You're okay," Claire murmured, not sure whether she was speaking to the animals or herself. She looped the rope around Archer's breast collar and secured the other end to a fallen tree trunk. The plan was simple. Archer would pull the trunk forward just enough to create a safe barrier for the goats and widen the ledge. Hard work, but doable. "Easy, big guy," Claire said, stepping aside. "Back and pull." Archer braced himself, and then he pulled. The earth shook under the force of him, muscles rippling under his coat, breath heaving but controlled. Inch by inch, the trunk shifted, grinding through dirt and rock. The ledge widened. The goats scrambled to safety, nudged gently forward by Archer's enormous shoulder as he angled his body to shield them from the direction of the rising heat. And then, just as the last goat cleared the narrow space, a young boy's voice pierced the air, thin and terrified. "Help! Somebody! Please!" Claire spun. At the far end of the ravine, a child clung to a scrubby juniper root, half hidden behind a spill of smoke. The drop behind him was steep, too steep for her to reach alone. She turned to Archer. For one heartbeat, horse and woman locked eyes. Archer moved first. He surged forward, dragging Claire with him as she tried to keep hold of the lead rope. She barely had time to throw it free before he picked his way across the treacherous ground, lowering his body so the boy could reach him. Claire scrambled beside them, shouting encouragement. "It's okay! Grab his mane! Yes, like that! Hold on!" Archer planted his hooves and leaned backward just enough to counter the boy's weight. The child scrambled up, gripping the thick winter coat with desperate fingers. Claire reached up, grabbed his jacket, and hauled him the last few feet onto safer ground. The boy sobbed once, a choked, raw sound, and buried his face against Archer's neck. Claire exhaled shakily. "You did it," she whispered to Archer. But Archer wasn't listening. His ears were pinned forward, toward the fire, toward something deeper, something calling him. The wind shifted again, hotter this time. They had saved the goats, saved the boy, but this fire was far from done with them. The boy's sobs still trembled against Claire's sleeve when the wind shifted again, this time carrying with it a sharper scent, resin, burning pine, the unmistakable warning of a fire changing direction. Claire lifted her head, squinting into the wavering haze. Smoke rolled low along the ground like a living creature, curling around rocks, licking at brush, tasting the earth before deciding what to consume next. "Claire!" Sheriff Dana's voice cut through the crackle of distant flames. She came scrambling down the slope toward them, face streaked with ash, eyes wide. "Spot fire jumped the ridge. We need to move, now!" Claire pulled the boy closer. "He's okay. Archer helped get him up." Dana didn't even question it. She only nodded once. Urgent. "Good. But we don't have time for anything else. The wind's bad. If it swings south—" A sudden piercing cry ripped through the ravine before she could finish. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal in the ordinary sense. It was a scream of fear, sharp enough to slice through the smoke. Archer's head snapped toward the sound. His entire body stiffened beneath the faint soot that had settled on his winter coat. Claire felt, rather than saw, the moment something ancient inside him awakened. The instinct Eli had hinted at, the old muscle memory carved by years of mountain work. Archer shifted his weight, his huge frame coming alive with purpose. The boy tightened his grip on Claire's arm. "There's something else down there," he whispered, voice small and trembling. Dana whipped her head toward the sound, too, one hand already going for her radio. "No," she muttered under her breath. "There shouldn't be." The cry came again. Closer. Raw. Desperate. A dog's howl. But not one of the Hughes family's dogs. This voice was deeper. Older. Strained with a panic that clawed at the edges of the mind. Dana cursed. "That's Redford's dog, old Ranger. He must have followed the goats in the night. Damn it." Claire stared into the smoke, her heartbeat sinking with Archer's as she listened. She could feel the animal trapped in that cry, the way fear reshaped breathing, the way pain hollowed out the center of the throat. She'd heard it in people. She could hear it now. "We can't leave him," Claire said. Dana rounded on her. "Claire, the fire's moving fast. We barely have minutes. Ranger's smart. If he can get out, he—" Another cry cut through the air. This one didn't sound like an animal moving. It sounded like one collapsing. Archer stomped a hoof. Not anxious. Not panicked. Determined. Claire placed a hand on his shoulder. The heat of his body hummed beneath her fingers. "He knows," she whispered. "He wants to go." "This isn't some rescue drill," Dana snapped. "This is a wildfire. If that dog's trapped—" "Then Archer can reach him," Claire said. "We can't." Dana hesitated, torn between duty and reality. Smoke swirled between them like a curtain of gray silk. The boy clung tighter to Claire's coat. Finally, Dana's voice broke. "You've got 3 minutes. No more." Claire didn't waste a second. She lifted the boy onto Dana's ATV, securing him in place. Then she turned back to Archer. His ears were pinned forward, muscles taut, ready. "Show me," Claire said softly. Archer surged forward. He moved like a creature suddenly remembering what he was born for, steady, swift, weight balanced low to the ground. Claire ran beside him, one hand on the lead rope, more for guidance than control. Archer led. She followed. The smoke grew thicker, slipping between her eyelashes, burning her throat. She pulled her shirt over her mouth and pressed on. Archer didn't falter. He dipped his head, searching, his hooves finding secure patches of earth even when Claire saw only danger. The cry came again. Weak now. Broken. Archer lunged toward it. "Easy," Claire choked out, stumbling over a root she hadn't seen. But Archer slowed just enough for her to regain balance, then pressed forward with renewed purpose. They rounded a jagged outcrop of stone, and the smoke shifted enough for Claire to see a dark shape curled against a fallen tree. Ranger, the old shepherd mix with grizzled fur and clouded eyes, lay trembling, his hind leg pinned under a chunk of fire-blackened timber. He whimpered, head lifting weakly when he saw them. "Oh, sweetheart," Claire breathed, rushing forward. She knelt beside him, running her hand down his muzzle. His breathing was fast, shallow, but he licked her fingers. Alive. Still fighting. Archer stepped in close, lowering his head to sniff Ranger gently. A deep rumble vibrated in his chest, a sound Claire had never heard from him. Protective. Purposeful. Claire pushed her shoulder against the charred log, but it didn't budge. She coughed hard, lungs screaming. "Archer, I need your help." Archer shifted closer, placing his chest against the larger end of the fallen timber. Claire wrapped the rope quickly around the trunk, looping it twice. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from urgency. "You can do this," she whispered. "Back. And pull." Archer leaned his weight backward, bracing his hooves in the soft earth. His muscles trembled, but he held. The log shifted, an inch, then another. Ranger whined as pressure released from his leg. Claire pulled him free, dragging him gently across the dirt. Archer straightened, breathing hard but steady. Smoke pushed at them like an angry tide. Then a sound like a sigh rolled through the ravine, the wind changing direction again. Claire's stomach dropped. She didn't need training to understand what that meant. "Archer, we need to move!" The giant draft horse lowered his head, nudged Ranger gently with his muzzle, then stepped aside so Claire could lift the old dog into her arms. He was heavier than she expected, his fur warm and singed at the edges, but she clung to him, stumbling forward. Archer walked beside her, body angled slightly outward as if shielding both of them from the hottest edge of the smoke. They emerged from the ravine just as Dana and 2 volunteers reached the trail. The sheriff's face flickered between shock and relief when she saw the dog in Claire's arms. "You're insane," Dana yelled, grabbing Ranger. "But thank God you are!" Archer stood behind Claire, chest heaving, soot streaking his coat. He lifted his head, ears tilting back toward the fire as if listening for something more, some final cry that might need him. Claire placed a shaking hand on his neck. "It's over," she murmured. "You did enough." Archer released a slow breath, long and weighted, and dropped his head beside her shoulder. Claire leaned against him, eyes burning. The smoke moved around them like a veil. And in that moment, she understood something she hadn't been able to grasp fully until now. Archer wasn't just remembering who he had been. He was choosing who he still was. By the time the last embers on the ridge dimmed into a dull orange glow, night had already taken the valley. Not the peaceful kind of night Timberfall usually wore, soft, blue-black, full of stars, but a heavy, unsettled darkness that still smelled faintly of smoke and fear. Claire stood beside the temporary triage tent the volunteers had set up near the ranger station. Her arms, still trembling from adrenaline, were wrapped around a blanket someone had draped over her shoulders. The world should have been calming down, but inside her chest everything was still running. Archer stood a few feet away, head lowered, breathing slow but deep. The soot along his coat made him look older, ancient even, like a weathered monument unearthed after a long absence. Volunteers moved around him carefully, silently acknowledging what he had done without needing to say it out loud. Ranger, bandaged and drowsy from pain medication, lay beside a heater, his tail thumping weakly whenever Archer shifted in his direction. "You two saved the whole damn ravine," Sheriff Dana muttered as she approached Claire, wiping ash from her brow with a weary hand. "We'd be hauling out bodies right now if you hadn't gone in." Claire shook her head. "It was Archer. He just knew." Dana followed her gaze. Archer stood quietly, eyes half closed, as though the fire had burned something from him, but also given something back, a memory, a purpose, a truth buried under months of abandonment. Claire's heart ached with something she hadn't felt in years, a complicated, gentle hope she didn't quite trust, but couldn't reject. Before Dana could respond, headlights cut through the dark. A worn beige pickup rolled into the clearing, engine sputtering, one headlight flickering. A figure stepped out slowly, leaning on a cane, shoulders hunched beneath a faded coat. For a moment, Claire didn't recognize the silhouette. Then the man lifted his head. Her breath left her in a single, painful rush. Hank Dawson. Her father. Older. Thinner. With a limp that hadn't been there the last time she saw him. Beard grown in gray patches. Eyes carrying the shadows of a man who had run 1 mile too many from his own regrets. He stopped a few feet from her, gripping the cane with both hands, as if the night might slide out from under him. "Claire," his voice cracked, thin and raw. The wind hummed across the clearing, carrying a thread of smoke between them. She felt her throat tighten, not with anger, not with relief, but with something in between, something she had never expected to face again. "What are you doing here?" she whispered. Hank didn't answer her right away. Instead, his gaze slid past her, to Archer. The moment Archer saw him, something shifted in the horse's stance. His ears flicked forward, his head raised, not high, not proud, but with a hesitant, searching motion that didn't belong to the stoic giant Timberfall believed him to be. Hank took a single step forward. His breath trembled. "I heard it on the radio. The fire. The rescue. They said a draft horse pulled a boy out of the ravine. A big Belgian with a scar down his flank." Archer took one step toward him. Claire couldn't move. Hank's voice grew softer, each word falling like a confession onto the cold dirt. "I thought, no. I prayed it couldn't be him, that he was somewhere safe. Not here, not in danger again." Archer moved closer, slow and deliberate, as if approaching something too fragile to rush. Claire's breath hitched. "You know him?" Hank finally turned toward her. The weight of the answer lived in his eyes before it ever reached his tongue. "He was mine," Hank whispered. "My partner, my current." Claire felt the ground shift under her boots. Hank swallowed hard. Before the accident, Archer and I worked mountain rescue. Years of it. That horse saved more lives than I can count. He carried injured hikers, hauled equipment, braced himself on slopes no horse had business standing on. His voice grew faint. He carried me more times than I carried him. A memory flickered in Archer's posture. Something gentle, reverent. He stepped until his muzzle hovered inches from Hank's chest. The old man raised his trembling hand and touched it to Archer's forehead. The horse closed his eyes. Claire watched, breath stuttering, as father and horse stood in a silence that was deeper than grief, deeper than reunion. It was the silence of something long broken settling, not fully healed, not yet whole, but no longer bleeding. Hank let out a slow, shuddering breath. When the slide came down, he didn't run. He braced into it, tried to hold me uphill. When they dug us out, he was half buried, barely breathing. Hank's eyes glistened. I couldn't keep working, couldn't support him. And the pain, physical, mental, I didn't know how to stay. He bowed his head. So I left everything behind, including him, including you. Claire felt those words strike the deepest parts of her. The abandoned teenager she had been, the grieving adult she had become, the exhausted paramedic who had walked away from her own battles because she didn't know how to stay either. You could have called, she whispered. I know. His voice cracked. I know. Archer nudged Hank's arm gently. Once, then again, as if grounding him. The old man choked out a fragile laugh through tears. He never stopped loving you, Claire said softly, surprising herself. He just forgot how to show it. Hank wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Horses forgive easier than people. Sometimes, Claire murmured, people learn too. The words felt foreign in her mouth, vulnerable but true. Before either of them could speak again, a soft bark sounded behind them. Ranger had forced himself onto unsteady legs, wobbling toward Archer and Hank. Claire knelt to steady him, her hand on his chest. He'll need care, she said. Rest, medicine, time. Hank nodded slowly. We all do. Archer stepped between them. Claire on one side, Hank on the other. Ranger pressed lightly against his leg, as though stitching together a shape that fate had torn apart years ago. The night wind cooled. The last glow of the fire flickered and then sank into darkness. Sheriff Dana approached, her voice low with a rare gentleness. He saved more than the boy, she said. He saved what was left of this family. Claire looked from Archer to her father. She didn't feel healed. Not yet. But she felt something sweeter. Something that didn't burn or bruise. Possibility. A beginning made of truth. A truth that had found its way home. The morning after the fire rose quietly, as if the valley itself were exhaling after holding its breath all night. A thin mist hovered over the fields, softening the edges of everything it touched. The barn roof, the fence line, the bare branches of the cottonwood. Claire stepped outside with a blanket draped over her shoulders, feeling the kind of ache that settles into a person after adrenaline drains away. Heavy, honest, and strangely human. She stood for a moment on the porch, listening to the faint sounds drifting from the barn. Not fear, not distress, just breath, slow, steady, alive. Inside, Archer stood in the center stall, wrapped in a halo of early morning light. His coat had been wiped clean of soot by the volunteers the night before, but streaks of ash still clung stubbornly to the strands along his mane. He looked older in that light, and somehow younger, like the years had both shaped him and peeled him back. Ranger lay curled beside him, a blanket covering his hind leg, tail giving a faint wag the moment Claire stepped in. "Morning, big guy," she whispered. Archer turned his head slowly toward her. Not with the haunted heaviness she had first seen weeks ago, nor with the sharp alertness he'd carried through the fire. This was different. A softness had settled into him, a quiet awareness that threaded through his gaze as if he were seeing her more clearly now. Seeing everything more clearly. Hank was already inside, leaning gently on his cane as he brushed Archer's shoulder with long, steady strokes. His movements were slower than the night before, stiff with age and pain, but full of intention. He looked up when Claire entered. "He didn't sleep much," Hank said. Every time Ranger whimpered, he nudged him until he calmed. Claire approached quietly. "He always took care of others first, didn't he?" Hank's breath caught, a soft, brittle sound. "Always." She stood beside him, watching his hands move through Archer's mane. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The barn filled with the sound of brushing, the dog's soft breathing, and the muted rustle of straw beneath Archer's shifting hooves. The quiet blurred around them, not empty this time, but full of something warm and patient. Finally, Hank lowered the brush. "I should have told you sooner," he said. Claire didn't look at him. "Told me what?" "That I didn't leave because I stopped loving you." His voice trembled. "I left because I didn't know how to stay after the mountain took what it did. My partner died under my watch. My body gave out. My mind didn't follow rules. I thought I was saving you from the mess I'd become." She swallowed hard. "You left without a note." "I know." "You left Mom alone." "I know," he whispered, barely audible. "And you left Archer too." Hank's jaw shook. "That's the part I've regretted every single day." Archer lifted his head slightly, as though sensing the weight in the air. His warm breath brushed Hank's hand, grounding him back into the moment. Claire leaned against the stall door, arms crossed loosely, but without the old armor she used to carry. "I handled emergencies my whole career," she said softly. "But grief? That's the one thing they never train you for." Hank glanced at her with eyes that looked years older than the rest of him. "I don't expect forgiveness." Claire shook her head. "I didn't say I was ready to give it." He nodded, accepting her words without complaint. A faint, sad smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "But you're talking to me. That's more than I deserve." She didn't argue. Instead, she stepped toward Archer the Massive. Horse lowered his muzzle until it brushed her shoulder. The contact was gentle, deliberate, a reminder that survival doesn't always end with strength. Sometimes it ends with softness. Ranger yawned, then nudged Claire's ankle with his nose, as if asking for attention too. She reached down to stroke behind his ear. His tail tapped the straw in a slow, grateful rhythm. "Sheriff said the boy we pulled out wants to come by later," Claire said, her voice steady. "He wants to bring Archer a treat." Hank chuckled weakly. "He deserves it." They spent the next hour tending to Archer's legs, checking for stiffness or hidden injuries. Every so often, Archer would lean into Claire's hands with the weight of a creature who knew exactly when someone needed a reminder they weren't alone. His presence filled the barn with a warmth that defied the cold morning air. As they worked, the door creaked open behind them. Eli stepped in, carrying a thermos and 2 ceramic mugs. "Mornin'," he said, setting the mugs on a nearby crate. "Thought you two could use some coffee. And I figured he nodded toward Hank, might want a familiar face around." Hank managed a small smile. "Thank you, old friend." Eli poured 3 servings, handing 1 to Claire. The coffee was dark and strong, the kind that settled deep in the chest. They drank in silence, the 3 of them standing in the golden light filtering through the cracks in the barn siding. Archer flicked an ear as if approving the quiet moment. "You know," Eli said after a while, "this horse walked around the canyon today like he'd never forgotten a thing, like the trail opened back up inside him." Claire nodded. "He remembered who he was." "No," Eli corrected softly, resting a calloused hand on Archer's flank. "He remembered who you let him become again." The words washed over the barn like a breath of something new. Claire felt her throat tighten, her eyes burning with the kind of ache that didn't hurt so much as remind her she had survived more than she knew. Outside, footsteps crunched on the frosted earth. Claire turned to see a small figure making its way across the yard. The boy from the ravine, bundled in a too large coat, holding something wrapped in bright paper. His mother followed slowly behind him. The boy hesitated at the barn door until Claire stepped aside to let him in. "I brought him a present," the boy said, voice small but earnest. He unwrapped the paper and held out a shiny red apple. "For saving me." Archer lowered his enormous head until his nose touched the boy's outstretched hand. He sniffed the apple, then took it gently, crunching once before lifting his head again. The boy giggled, a soft, pure sound that seemed to dissolve the last remnants of smoke clinging to the barn. Claire knelt beside him. "He likes you." "He's a hero," the boy whispered. Claire looked up at Archer, at Hank, at Eli, 3 beings who had all been broken in their own ways, each learning to stand again in the quiet aftermath of fire. "He is," she said, "in more ways than you know." When the boy left, the barn settled into another silence, not empty but full of breath and warmth and the gentle weight of things slowly healing. Claire brushed her fingers through Archer's mane. "You're staying here," she murmured. "With us." Archer blinked slowly, then rested his head lightly against her shoulder, sealing the promise without words. Hank exhaled. "Guess I'm staying too, if you'll have me." Claire didn't answer right away. She placed her hand over Archer's cheek, feeling his steady heartbeat under her palm. The horse shifted closer, anchoring her. Finally, she nodded. "We'll figure it out." Outside, the sun finally breached the ridge, spilling soft light over Timberfall. The smoke had cleared. The valley breathed again. And inside the old barn, surrounded by the quiet footsteps of those who had survived both fire and loss, Claire realized something simple and profound. Not all the pieces of a broken life needed to be put back the way they were. Some could remain changed. Some could remain softer. Some could stay exactly where they had fallen. Because Archer's footsteps now stood beside them. The kind that never left, once they returned. The next morning arrived with a quiet that didn't feel empty anymore. It had weight now, the kind of gentle silence that settles on a place after something painful has broken open and begun. Slowly, to mend. Claire stood by the kitchen window, watching faint ribbons of steam rise from the coffee mug cupped in her hands. Outside, the valley glowed under the soft gold of sunrise. Thin frost clung to the fence posts like lace, delicate and temporary. She found herself breathing deeper than she had in months. Not because the air was cleaner here, though it was, but because something inside her chest no longer felt locked away. The house, once suffocating with memories, now felt lived in again. Not healed, but lived in. She stepped outside, pulling her coat tight around her. The cold brushed her cheeks, tender and familiar. The path to the barn bore fresh tracks from 2 sets of boots and 1 enormous pair of hooves. Hank must have gone to check on Archer already. Their footsteps looked uneven in the snow, Hank's gait still stiff and careful, but the horse's prints beside them gave the picture a strange sense of balance, as if Archer had walked close enough to guard each step. When Claire pushed open the barn door, warm air touched her face. Straw rustled quietly. And there he was. Archer stood in the center of the aisle, his head lowered toward Hank, who sat on a wooden stool repairing a worn leather strap. Ranger dozed nearby with his muzzle resting on his paws, tail sweeping once at the sound of Claire's arrival. Hank looked up with a small, unsure smile. "We were waiting for you." Claire stepped toward them, her boots sinking into the soft straw. She placed her hand on Archer's shoulder, feeling the steady warmth beneath his winter coat. His breath washed gently across her sleeve, a soft huff that carried more reassurance than words could. "He looks stronger today," Claire murmured. "He is," Hank said. "Something changed in him. In all of us, I guess." She nodded, running her hand through Archer's mane. The strands fell like softened gold between her fingers. There was no tension in him today, no guarded stillness, just a quiet presence. The kind that made you feel grounded just by standing near it. A knock sounded on the barn door. Eli stepped in, carrying a small crate filled with fresh apples, oats, and a folded blanket. "Brought a few things," he said. "Figured Archer could use the spoils of being a local legend." Claire laughed softly, the first laugh that felt real in a long time. "He deserves it." "Damn right he does," Eli said, patting Archer's flank. "Half the town's talking about him. Some folks want to put his picture in the Timberfall Gazette. Maybe let him be the honorary marshal for the winter parade. You know how people get with a hero." Hank chuckled, shaking his head. "He's no parade horse." "No," Eli agreed, smiling. "But he's ours." Archer flicked his ears forward, leaning into Claire's hand. She felt that same quiet recognition she'd felt the first day he'd let her touch him. But now it wasn't carved from sorrow. It was shaped by something gentler, something that felt very close to gratitude. Claire turned to Hank. "You're staying here?" she asked softly. Hank hesitated, his hand stilled around the leather strap. "Only if you'll have me. I don't have much to offer, Claire. Not money, not strength. Just time. Maybe a little wisdom I had to break a few bones to learn." "You have something better," she said, surprising even herself. "You're trying." He swallowed hard. Archer nudged his shoulder gently, as if seconding the statement. Hank looked down, tears catching the corners of his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For everything." Claire didn't rush to answer. Instead, she stepped closer and rested her forehead lightly against Archer's neck, grounding herself in his warmth. She felt him shift, steady and patient. Behind her, Hank waited, not pushing, not pleading, just waiting. Finally, she breathed out. "We'll figure it out," she said softly. "All of us." Hank exhaled sharply, a sound of relief and ache mingled together. Eli smiled quietly and began unpacking the crate, pretending not to notice the emotion in the room. They spent the late morning tending to Archer and Ranger. Claire brushed the last soot from Archer's coat, while Hank cleaned his hooves. Eli recited old ranch stories that made Ranger thump his tail, and made Claire shake her head with a half-smile. The barn became a place filled with warmth again, a place of breathing, a place of second chances. Later, when the boy from the ravine arrived with his mother, carrying another apple and a small handmade card, Archer lowered his head so the boy could hug him. The gesture was gentle, deliberate. Claire watched with her hand over her heart. Something inside her felt full, and steady, and new. As the sun began to dip behind the ridge, painting the valley in amber and lavender, Claire walked Archer out into the pasture. He followed her without a rope, his hoofbeats slow and sure behind her. At the center of the field, she stopped and turned to face him. The wind stirred his mane. The light caught the scar along his flank, turning it into a silver ribbon. "You saved me," she whispered, the words escaping before she could swallow them back. "You saved all of us." Archer stepped closer until their foreheads almost touched. His breath warmed the cold between them. And in that moment, with the mountains standing ancient and unmoving behind them, Claire felt everything she had been carrying for years begin to settle gently into place. Not fixed, not erased, but held. Finally held. She rested her hand against his cheek, feeling the slow, steady pulse beneath her palm. "No one is useless," she murmured, "when a heart still beats." Archer responded with a soft rumble, low and warm, the sound of a creature who had found his way home twice, once to this land, and once to the people who now stood beside him. Behind them, Hank and Eli watched from the fence, their silhouettes quiet and still in the fading light. For the first time, Claire didn't feel like she was walking toward a future she had to outrun. She felt like she was walking beside it. The mountains exhaled. The valley breathed. And Claire, Archer, and every fractured part of her life took a step forward. Together, in the soft Wyoming dusk. If this story touched you in any way, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share a simple comment below and let me know what part stayed with you the most. And if you'd like to join us for more gentle, heartfelt stories like this one, make sure to subscribe so you never miss what comes next.